This session is about the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s and how they influenced American society and American culture. A counterculture is described as a group that is going against social norms or the social mainstream or status quo. And that's what happened during the 1960s and 70s. Not all people in the counterculture were hippies. Hippies were a very small percentage of the counterculture. Counterculture also included not just young people, although they comprised most of it, but also adults who were wanting to change the way things were. Although the roots of the counterculture went back at least to World War II, things like the beatniks, people like the beatniks, books like Jack Kerouac's On the Road, the anti-heroes, as we talked about with James Dean. The real beginning of the movement was in San Francisco, in the Haight-Ashbury area. It became known as the Haight. The Haight was an old, rundown neighborhood where rent was cheap. So a lot of struggling artists and other young people looking for some place to live were able to afford the rent in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. And they began to congregate there. Not having much money, they got by as well as they could. These young people and artists in the Haight began to pick up secondhand clothing, whatever they could afford. They might pick up a couch or a chair that had been thrown out, left on the curb for the garbage men, and use that in their apartments. To afford the rent, they began to share apartment space. But they ignored the norms of the day because both men and women would share the apartment, pay the rent, and basically violate the norms of having to be married to cohabitate. Now, this was not necessarily sexual. It was a matter of economic survival. They did the same thing for their food. If somebody had gotten a job and had a little money, then they shared to buy food. And so it became a collective effort by these artists and young people to survive economically. Because they didn't have a lot of money, they entertained themselves. The artists playing music on the streets, that sort of thing. But they spent a lot of time discussing themselves and their view of life. And one of the things they began to try to figure out were questions like, what is my purpose in life? Why am I here? Who am I really? Discover my inner self, not the self that is defined by society or by parents or siblings, but who am I really? My inner self. It's interesting to note that in a survey of college freshmen in the 1960s, when the question was asked, why are you in college? Well, today, most of you would answer to get a better job. In the 1960s, the majority of college students answered that question, that their purpose in college was to discover a philosophy of life. As they tried to figure out what their life was all about, they came to a very human understanding that life should be celebrated, that human beings should be celebrated. And so they put together what became known as the Human Be-In, a celebration of just being human. Many of the bands that were from the Hate, who were not big yet, played free music like Santana, Steve Miller Band, the Grateful Dead. There were speakers like Allen Ginsberg, and most significantly, Timothy Leary. And so they gathered in Golden Gate Park to celebrate just being alive. One of the speakers there was Dr. Timothy Leary, a Harvard psychologist who in his experiments had tried ways to break through psychological barriers that were holding people back. And one of the things that he tried was a drug that had been developed by the CIA, hoping that it was a truth serum. Well, it wasn't, but he felt like that drug enabled people to break through the barriers that they put around themselves and discover their true reason for being. That drug was LSD. And so he became a huge advocate for LSD as a way to discover yourself. And he preached this, and because the people in the Hate were trying to find this inner self, they began to experiment. Now, they were always using pot. That became the drug of choice because it was cheaper than buying alcohol. And so the drug culture begins not just for recreation, although many of them were using it that way, but also for a more profound purpose in some cases of trying to break down the inhibitions that we put on ourselves, that society puts on ourselves, that our parents put on us, so that they could discover who they truly were. Timothy Leary preached a philosophy that was simplified by the hearers. He did not mean this in the way it was taken by most people, but that philosophy was turn on, tune in, drop out. Turn on using LSD, tune in to your inner self, and drop out of society that is trying to put restrictions on you. That's what the young people heard. And so the true hippies, fewer than 1% of young people, began to try to follow Timothy Leary's philosophy. Turn on, tune in, drop out. A few young people began to take Timothy Leary's advice literally when he said drop out of society, and began to move to remote areas where they could, in their minds, be free of the restraints that society put on people. And so they would move out into remote areas away from everybody else for the freedom that they believed it offered. A few groups formed communities that became known as communes, where it was a completely socialistic society. Everything belonged to everybody. There were no rules or restrictions. The entire group was in charge of raising the children. And there was no such thing as the social constraints of things like marriage. And so they began to build what they believed would be self-sustaining communities that they controlled. It kind of reminds me of the current uh, shows that are on TV about Alaska, the last frontier, and stuff like that, subsistence living. That's what they envisioned. Unfortunately, most of these were city kids. They didn't know how to grow their own food and produce their own food. And so the commune movement quickly imploded because they simply could not sustain that kind of lifestyle. To differentiate themselves from society, many of these young people began to wear bright colors in their clothing. The men wore long hair. They began to commune with nature and see themselves as a new tribe of Americans who were going to influence the rest of the country. They saw themselves as living as part of nature, and therefore environmentalism became very important to them. Their view was that all man was part of the same universe, and therefore we should be at one with that universe, one with nature. This helps to explain some of the nudity, because if they feel like they are one with nature, nature created them naked, and therefore, why not? It was celebrating being a part of nature and the universe. Keep in mind that many of the parents of the youth of the counterculture had been raised during the Great Depression and during World War II. Therefore, they were accustomed to falling in line with what they were told to do. This began to drive the young people nuts. And so the counterculture basically started rejecting the standards set by their parents, especially those standards of racial segregation, of war, of no sex outside of marriage, of women's rights, of materialism, and of being socially regimented, told at all times, this is what you're expected to do and you will do it. Culture divided the country between those who wanted to hold on to the old traditional standards and those who were challenging it. By the 1970s, the goals of the counterculture had been largely met and had become part of American culture. To help you differentiate between the counterculture and mainstream culture, here are a list of characteristics that each group had. Now, not everyone who believed in mainstream culture believed every one of these things that they list here. Not everyone in the counterculture believed everything that's listed under counterculture here. But there was enough variance between mainstream culture and counterculture that it caused social unrest, even combat in some ways. It was a time of social upheaval when one group was trying to hold on to the standard status quo and another group was saying, no, we're not going to go along with that. Now, I mentioned that probably fewer than 1% of America's youth were fully hippies, the tune in, turn on, drop out stuff. But their belief systems influenced the entire baby boomer generation. For example, these two young people. Are they hippies? Oh, not. Actually, they are college students at Yale Law School. This is Bill and Hillary Clinton. They did not drop out, and yet some of the attitudes of the counterculture influenced them. This is the way the vast majority of young people were. They did not drop out. They continued to go to school, continued to work, continued to go for military service if they were required to. But the ideas of self-examination, the ideas of things needed to change, were highly influencing to many young people of the baby boomer generation. The tiny group of hippies out in San Francisco, their ideas began to spread, and they entered virtually every area of social protest. For example, here, they're asking the question, which is the greater sin, using drugs or dropping bombs? To the counterculture, there was no question what the answer to that was. Dropping bombs was the greater sin. This television commercial has been voted by advertising people as one of the most effective of all time. But it's using the messages of the counterculture to sell Coca-Cola. Listen to this and see how far the influence of the counterculture spread from that few dozen hippies out there in San Francisco. This video summarizes some of the impact or the influence of the counterculture on American society to this day. Now, it incorrectly labels all young people as hippies. As I've pointed out, a very small portion of the young generation were actually the tune in, turn on, drop out. However, the influence spread throughout American society. And this video gives a summary of some of those influences. College students across the country were also being influenced by the counterculture. At the University of Michigan, a group of students formed a new organization called Students for a Democratic Society. They were making a political statement, and they listed what they saw as a better way to govern: democracy of individual participation. Individuals should share in determining the direction of his life. In other words, freedom. Society organized by to be encouraging to independence. And so their vision was a less restrictive, a less regimented country, a less regimented government, and therefore more personal freedom. Many young people were challenging the idea of war, and particularly the Vietnam War. As the Beatles sang, all we are saying is give peace a chance. And once again, we see the young people asking, what's worse, making love or making war? When make love, not war became one of the standard chants of the anti-war protesters. The organizers of some of these anti-war demonstrations took a page from Dr. King's playbook. They realized that image mattered. And so, for instance, this picture. Do you think that young man brought flowers just for the heck of it to this demonstration against the war? He created a photo op by putting flowers in the barrel of the gun. Again, what is the thing to do? Enjoy the flowers or shoot people? More and more people in the counterculture came to see the war itself as an absurdity. This was one of the most popular expressions of war as absurd. What makes more sense? Isn't bombing for peace like you saying that you're going to have sex for virginity? It doesn't make rational sense. And so more and more the anti-war movement was about war itself is an atrocious absurdity. Now, granted, many of the young men in particular who were speaking out against the war were doing it in their own self-interest to some extent, because they didn't want to get drafted. They didn't want to go and risk dying. But part of the reason for them not being willing to make that commitment was that they didn't see any reason for the war itself, particularly war in Vietnam, halfway around the world in a little country that almost no one cared about. The attitudes of the counterculture began to spread to some of the older generation. For instance, here's a group of ladies, not young people, protesting the war and calling for an end to the war in Vietnam and the social crisis at home. Now, these are not hippies. These are not turn on, tune in, drop out people. These are just concerned citizens. The great irony of Lyndon Johnson's presidency was that while his foreign policy, and particularly the Vietnam War and the escalation of that war with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, it caused protests in the streets, riots, and yet his domestic policy was liberal and progressive. Remember, it was Lyndon Johnson who had signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then he proposed what he called his Great Society, a program to improve the lot of every American. Included in his Great Society was the war on poverty, looking for ways to lift people out of poverty. This video describes Johnson's war on poverty, his belief that in the richest nation in the world, no one should go without proper housing, proper medical care, go without food. And so he began to put programs into place that would address the problems of poverty in America. Johnson saw his programs as being a temporary fix, a ladder that people could use to climb out of poverty. And therefore, he had no concept of it becoming a way of life, which some of his programs ultimately did, for a seemingly permanent poor class. That was not his intention. His intention was to provide bridges, to provide ladders where people could get themselves out of poverty. Johnson's vision for his war on poverty, for example, included food stamps, Head Start programs, a Job Corps to help people who did not have job skills get those job skills so they could get a job. VISTA, which was a domestic program like John Kennedy's Peace Corps was abroad, where volunteers would go out into impoverished areas and through training and education and help make people better prepared to get themselves out of poverty. Again, he did not envision that food stamps would become a way of life. He saw it as a temporary fix, so people could eat while they prepared themselves to get a job. He saw federally funded housing as a transition from poor housing to being able to afford your own housing. He saw child care in things like Head Start and Upward Bound as ways to help young people who are trapped in this cycle of poverty break out through educational programs designed to help with the transition from poverty to self-sufficiency. His Great Society programs, such as Medicare and Medicaid, public broadcasting, endowments for the arts and the humanities, were all designed to help uplift all Americans. Medicare, of course, is for retired people. Medicaid for the poor who cannot afford medical care. Public broadcasting was seen as bringing the classics, bringing Shakespeare to the masses, bringing symphonies to the masses, cultural uplift. That was his vision. We can argue about how much of his vision worked. It seemed to many Americans in 1968 that the country was in danger of blowing apart. Major events like the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the leading Democratic candidate for president that year, and the riots in Chicago that surrounded the Democratic convention. The Democrats gathered in Chicago to nominate their candidate for president in the 1968 elections. And what it turned into was a police riot. When protesters showed up at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, they were told by the Chicago mayor that their presence would not be tolerated. They ignored the mayor and began to hold their protests. at which time the mayor ordered his police to disperse the protesters. And they did with violence, billy clubs, beatings. And so it turned into a riot outside the Democratic National Convention. There was also fighting inside the convention. It seemed like nobody could get along. As a result of the protesters ignoring the mayor's orders, the leaders of the protest were arrested and put on trial in what became a circus trial, as the leaders of the protesters sought to make a mockery of the justice system. Two events in 1969 proved to be the height of the counterculture. The two were the opening on Broadway of the rock musical Hair, which was about the counterculture, and Woodstock, advertised as 3 days of peace and music. They expected maybe 20,000 people. They sold about 20,000 tickets to it. However, about 300,000 people showed up. And in 3 days, when virtually every American musical group performed, when young people were deluged by thunderstorms and were covered in mud, were on drugs, some of them. There were a few ODs. But with 300,000 people there for 3 days, there was not one single act of violence. There were no fights. There were no murders. There were no shootings. And the supporters of the counterculture pointed to this as, see, if we all just learn to love one another, we can have a world like this where there is no violence. This young couple became kind of iconic of Woodstock. After the major thunderstorm and the whole field had turned to mud, here they are covered in a muddy blanket, still hugging each other. The man with his long hair. Critics of the counterculture pointed to this as, see, this is what the country's going to come to. Just a bunch of dirty, barefoot ragamuffins. But that couple did not subvert the United States. In fact, that couple went on to become married with children. He was a teacher, she was a social worker. As so many feared when that picture of them at Woodstock emerged, did not happen. Yes, America changed, but it was not the overthrow of American society that critics of the counterculture predicted. Because by the late 60s and early 70s, many of the baby boomers were now college students, colleges became the focal point of many of the protests. And it wasn't just anti-war protests. It was also protests about things like the university providing research for the military, the university not doing more to preserve the environment, the university putting restrictions on students' free speech. And so the colleges and universities were full of protests. At a few, student protesters took over the administration building and had sit-ins to protest actions of that university. At Kent State, after it was announced the United States had started rebombing in Vietnam, war protesters turned out at the university. Ohio's governor was determined to stop this demonstration. What he saw as a trained militant revolutionary group trying to undermine the American way of life. And so he sent in the National Guard to put down this protest at Kent State. At one point, and we don't know exactly what caused it, the National Guard began to fire their weapons into the demonstrators. 4 college students died, one of whom was not even a demonstrator. He was simply walking to class and got hit by a stray bullet. To many in the United States, this was a symbol of the militancy that was becoming American society. To others, it was a proper reaction to young people who were not listening to orders, who were not obeying, who were trespassing, who were breaking the law. This is how divided the United States was, still in the 1970s. Another on-campus shooting by the police occurred at the predominantly black Jackson State. There was almost no press coverage of this incident, and yet 2 young students were shot to death by the police for protesting. Or this one of a topless girl celebrating life. Well, it's a no-brainer. The media covered the counterculture. Now, they didn't always cover it positively, but this is a good example of how the counterculture was able to use Dr. King's strategies for attracting media attention to their cause. The reaction of those supporting the war and opposing the counterculture were public relations disasters. For example, these two posters. One that says, "No to hippies," and it shows a picture of a man and woman embracing. The other one, "Plant bombs, not trees. Get out of here, you environmentalists." Both of these are kind of saying, hey, the counterculture has a point. Is hugging someone bad? Is planting a tree bad? And so those who opposed the counterculture and supported the war in Vietnam were not very good at what is called today messaging, getting a positive spin on their message. The same can be said for those who were fighting against the Great Society. I fight poverty, I work. And so these kinds of clumsy public relations tools that were used by the anti-counterculture and the pro-war and the anti-Great Society programs, they were not as effective in attracting positive media attention. Therefore, it seems like everyone was in favor of the counterculture. Everyone was in favor of, or was against the war. It seemed like everyone was in favor of the Great Society programs, when that was not the case at all. The majority of Americans probably agreed with the sentiments in these buttons. But when it came to playing the media, they were very clumsy and did not create a good impression. Those who opposed the counterculture and supported the war began to fight back. Some of these were known as hard hat rallies, where industrial workers wearing their protective headgear would attack peace marchers. This one was in New York City. And so there is a sizable segment of the population that is not in favor of the counterculture, is supporting the war, but the image of these riots in the streets creates fear in more and more Americans that the country has gone completely off the rails and needs to get back to the proper direction. And there were students on college campuses that held pro-war rallies, saying that we needed to win the war in Vietnam. Not just fight it, but we needed to go ahead and just win it. And so the country is so divided that you've got anti-war and pro-war rallies taking place on the same college campuses. A group of conservative college students got together and decided that they would counter the Port Huron statement and speak out against the Students for a Democratic Society. They gathered and they put out what was called the Sharon Statement. In part, it stated its belief in conservatism. It stated that it believed in traditional values. in small government, in law and order. And so this group began to spread through college campuses also as a counter to the Students for a Democratic Society. The organization became known as Young Americans for Freedom. And they were in favor of limited government, of laissez-faire economics, and doing anything it took to defeat communism. This was a direct conservative reaction to the Students for a Democratic Society. So the Americans for Freedom was a countering college organization supporting conservative values. And in some ways, it can be said that the modern conservative movement, whether you think of it with Reagan or the Tea Party or whatever, began with these young people and this Sharon statement. Lyndon Johnson had said that he would not run for re-election in 1968. So the Democrats came together in Chicago amid the riots to nominate a candidate. And they were very divided. Because of this, the Republican nominee, Richard Nixon, was able to use his message of basically shut up hippies, by which he meant putting down the counterculture, standing for law and order, standing for social values and moral values. This was the message of his campaign. Nixon directed his message to ordinary Americans, those Americans who were not out in the streets protesting, who were not sitting in the college administrative building, those Americans who were going to work every day, coming home, maybe having a beer, barbecuing in the backyard on the weekend, were going to church on Sundays. In other words, those who were living a traditional American life. He called this group of people the silent majority. And they were successful in voting for Richard Nixon, hoping that he would put an end to the strife of the country. So in 1968, Richard Nixon is elected President of the United States. And he comes to the White House believing in law and order, that people who break the law should be arrested, believing that drugs are bad, and looking for a way to end the war in Vietnam on American terms. These were his promises, and they won him the election.